The Perfectionist Collective's invasion fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Zephyrian territory with the cold precision that had made them the most feared enemy in the galaxy. Their ships moved in perfect mathematical formations and their weapons fired with calculating accuracy that left no room for error or chance. Admiral Korvax, commanding the Zephyrian defense fleet, watched the enemy approach with growing dread. His forces had prepared for months using traditional tactics and strategies that had served the Empire well for centuries, but he feared they would not be enough against such methodical perfection. The first battle confirmed his worst fears. The collective ships anticipated every Zephyrian maneuver and countered each attack with devastating efficiency. Their perfect coordination allowed them to concentrate overwhelming firepower at exactly the right moment, while avoiding return fire with mathematical precision. Within hours, the Zephyrian fleet had lost a third of its ships and was forced to retreat to defensive positions around the Empire's core worlds. The collective followed methodically, destroying orbital facilities and planetary defenses with the same cold efficiency they had shown in space. Emperor Zalthon summoned his military advisors to an emergency council, but their reports offered little hope. The enemy's tactical perfection made conventional resistance nearly impossible, and their technological advantages seemed insurmountable. Princess Lyra attended the War Council and listened as one general after another admitted that traditional strategies had failed. The collective's ability to predict and counter every logical move had rendered normal military thinking useless. When the meeting reached its darkest moment, Princess Lyra stood and proposed something that shocked everyone present. She suggested that they ask Jake Morrison to develop new tactics based on human unpredictability rather than Zephyrian logic. The generals protested that warfare was too important to entrust to an alien civilian who had no military training or experience. They argued that chaos might work for engineering problems, but battle required discipline and careful planning. But Emperor Zalthon remembered how Jake had solved impossible problems by rejecting conventional wisdom and embracing controlled chaos. He authorized Princess Lyra to work with Jake on developing unconventional approaches to fighting the collective. Jake studied the battle reports and quickly identified the fundamental problem. The Zephyrian military was trying to out-perfect an enemy that had achieved mathematical perfection in warfare. This was a contest they could not win using conventional methods. He proposed a radical strategy based on deliberate unpredictability. Instead of trying to coordinate perfectly, the Zephyrian forces would introduce controlled randomness into every aspect of their operations. Jake worked with Princess Lyra and a team of young engineers to modify the remaining Zephyrian ships. They installed manual override systems that could randomly alter course and speed during battle, making the ships impossible to predict. They added weapons systems that operated on controlled chaos rather than precise targeting. These weapons would fire in random patterns that could not be calculated or anticipated by the collective's tactical computers. Most importantly, they modified the ship's formation flying systems to include deliberate errors and course corrections. This would make the fleet look disorganized, but actually make it impossible for the enemy to predict their movements. The Zephyrian admirals were horrified by these modifications and predicted disaster if their carefully trained crews were forced to operate randomly. They argued that chaos would be more dangerous to themselves than to the enemy. But Jake had learned from his engineering experience that controlled chaos was different from pure randomness. The modifications included hidden patterns and backup, systems that would prevent true disaster while maintaining unpredictability. Princess Lyra convinced her father to authorize a test of Jake's concepts using a small volunteer fleet commanded by young officers who were willing to try unconventional approaches. The test took place during the next collective attack on a border system. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. The chaotically modified ships proved nearly impossible for the collective to target effectively, while their random weapon patterns found gaps in the enemy's perfect defensive formations. For the first time since the invasion began, Zephyrian forces achieved a tactical victory against the Perfectionist Collective. The enemy ships retreated in confusion, unable to develop countermeasures against tactics that had no logical pattern. Emperor Zalthon immediately ordered all remaining ships to be modified according to Jake's specifications. The entire Zephyrian military had to learn new approaches to warfare that emphasized flexibility over precision and adaptation over planning. Jake found himself appointed as Special Advisor for Unconventional Tactics, with authority to modify military systems and train crews in human-inspired combat techniques. Princess Lyra worked alongside him, developing theoretical frameworks for chaos-based strategy. The final battle took place above the Imperial capital, where the Collective had concentrated their entire remaining fleet for a decisive assault. The Zephyrian defenders used every principle Jake had taught them about turning apparent weakness into unexpected strength ships that appeared to be fleeing suddenly reversed course and attacked from unexpected directions. Weapons that seemed to be missing their targets were actually following complex random patterns that created devastating crossfire. The Collective's perfect tactical computers could not adapt to opponents who deliberately made mistakes and then turned those mistakes into advantages. Their mathematical precision became a liability when facing enemies who embraced controlled chaos. Jake commanded the battle from the flagship alongside Princess Lyra and Admiral Korvax, who had initially opposed his unconventional methods. The Admiral watched in amazement as chaos tactics consistently outmaneuvered the enemy's perfect formations. The turning point came when Jake ordered the entire fleet to execute a maneuver that appeared to be a catastrophic navigation error. The Collective ships moved to exploit what seemed like a fatal mistake, only to discover they had been lured into a carefully planned trap. The randomized weapon patterns that had seemed so chaotic suddenly revealed their hidden coordination as the entire Zephyrian fleet concentrated fire on the trapped enemy ships. The Collective's command vessel was destroyed along with most of their remaining forces. The surviving enemy ships retreated from Zephyrian space and the invasion was over. For the first time in galactic history, the Perfectionist Collective had been decisively defeated by opponents they had considered inferior. Emperor Zalthon realized that Jake Morrison had not only saved the Empire, but had fundamentally changed how Zephyrians understood technology and strategy. The human approach of embracing controlled imperfection had proven superior to their traditional pursuit of perfection. The Emperor made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He announced that Jake Morrison would be welcomed as an honored member of the Imperial family through marriage to Princess Lyra, if both were willing. Princess Lyra accepted immediately, and Jake, overcome with emotion, agreed to spend his life helping to bridge the gap between human adaptability and Zephyrian precision. Their wedding became a celebration that lasted for weeks and included representatives from dozens of species throughout the galaxy. The ceremony symbolized a new era of cooperation between different approaches to science and problem-solving. Jake Morrison, who had started as a simple mechanic, fixing broken hyperdrives, found himself married to the most beautiful princess in the galaxy and serving as humanity's first ambassador of practical engineering to the Zephyrian Empire. The Empire itself was transformed by the integration of human engineering principles. Systems became more reliable, infrastructure became more adaptable, and the rigid hierarchy that had defined Zephyrian society began to embrace flexibility and innovation. Princess Lyra established new research institutes where human and Zephyrian scientists worked together to develop hybrid technologies that combined the best aspects of both approaches. Jake continued to work on practical problems, but now his solutions influenced the development of technology throughout the Empire. His philosophy of making things work with available materials spread to every world under Zephyrian control. Years later, when Jake looked back on his incredible journey from cargo ship mechanic to Imperial advisor, he realized that the most important discovery had not been about technology at all. He had learned that differences between species and cultures were not obstacles to overcome, but strengths to be combined. The chaos of human thinking complemented the precision of Zephyrian science, and together they achieved things that neither could accomplish alone. Princess Lyra had discovered that love could transcend the boundaries between worlds, and that the most ordinary person could change the course of galactic history through courage, creativity, and determination. Their marriage proved that even the most unlikely dreams could come true when people were willing to embrace the beautiful imperfection of life itself. News of Jake Morrison's success spread through the Zephyrian Empire like wildfire and created reactions that nobody had expected. Young engineers began experimenting with human-inspired techniques in secret, while older scientists denounced the methods as dangerous chaos that threatened their orderly civilization. Emperor Zalthon found himself in an impossible position. He could not deny that Jake had solved problems that had stumped the Empire's best minds for centuries, but accepting human methods meant admitting that Zephyrian science was incomplete. Princess Lyra became Jake's unofficial guide to Zephyrian culture and spent hours showing him the wonders of their advanced civilization. She took him to the floating gardens of the Imperial Palace, where plants from 100 worlds grew in perfect harmony. Jake was amazed by the beauty of Zephyrian art and architecture, but he also noticed things that the princess had never considered. He pointed out that the floating gardens would be more resilient if they included some native weeds along with the carefully selected plants. Princess Lyra laughed at the suggestion, until Jake explained that weeds could provide backup nutrition for the soil and alternate habitats for beneficial insects. His idea of deliberately including imperfection to strengthen the whole system was becoming a recurring theme. As they walked through the crystal spires of the capital city, Jake shared stories about Earth and human culture. He described the controlled chaos of human cities where unplanned growth created vibrant neighborhoods that could adapt to changing needs. Princess Lyra had grown up believing that perfect planning was always superior to random development, but Jake's descriptions made her wonder if humans might have discovered something important about the value of flexibility. Their conversations continued late into the night as Princess Lyra showed Jake the advanced laboratories where she conducted her research. Jake was impressed by the sophisticated equipment, but suggested modifications that could make the instruments more versatile. He proposed adding manual override controls to automated systems and backup sensors that used different principles from the primary ones. Each suggestion reflected the human philosophy of preparing for unexpected problems rather than assuming everything would work perfectly. Princess Lyra found herself falling in love with Jake's optimistic worldview and his ability to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. He never seemed discouraged by failure and always believed that any problem could be solved if you were creative enough. Jake was equally fascinated by Princess Lyra's brilliant mind and her genuine kindness toward everyone she met. He had expected royal arrogance, but found instead a woman who truly cared about using her knowledge to help others. Their growing relationship scandalized the imperial court, where marriages were typically arranged to strengthen political alliances between powerful families. The idea of a princess choosing her own partner based on love rather than duty was almost unthinkable. Court advisors warned Emperor Zalthon that allowing his daughter to associate with a primitive human would damage the Empire's reputation throughout the galaxy. They argued that other species would lose respect for Zephyrian superiority if royalty married beneath their status. But Princess Lyra had inherited her father's strong will and refused to end her friendship with Jake. She argued that human engineering had proven its value, and that dismissing Jake as primitive was both incorrect and foolish. The political situation became more complicated when young Zephyrian engineers began implementing human-inspired modifications throughout the Empire's infrastructure. Power grids became more stable when buffer zones were added, and transportation systems became more reliable when backup options were installed. However, these improvements also created tension between traditional scientists who wanted to maintain established methods and younger engineers who were excited about exploring human approaches to problem-solving. Jake found himself at the center of a technological revolution that he had never intended to start. He continued working on practical problems while trying to avoid the political conflicts that his success had created. Princess Lyra began spending more time in the engineering sections of the palace, where she could work alongside Jake on various projects. She discovered that she enjoyed the hands-on problem-solving much more than the theoretical research she had done before. Together, they developed new hybrid approaches that combined Zephyrian precision with human adaptability. Their collaboration produced innovations that neither species could have achieved alone and demonstrated the potential benefits of cooperation between different ways of thinking. Jake taught Princess Lyra about human concepts like improvisation and the beauty of imperfection, while she showed him the elegant mathematical principles underlying Zephyrian technology. Each learned to appreciate the strengths of the other's approach. Their partnership extended beyond engineering, as Princess Lyra introduced Jake to Zephyrian philosophy and art, while he shared human music and literature with her. She was particularly fascinated by human stories about ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things through determination and creativity. Jake was moved by Zephyrian poetry that described the harmony between all living things and their connection to the cosmic forces that shape the universe. He began to understand that beneath their formal exterior, Zephyrians had deep appreciation for beauty and meaning, as their personal relationship deepened. Jake and Princess Lyra had to navigate the complex protocols of imperial court life. Jake learned to dress appropriately for formal occasions, while Princess Lyra discovered the simple pleasures of working with her hands. The court gradually began to accept Jake's presence, although many nobles remained skeptical about the wisdom of mixing human chaos with Zephyrian order. Some feared that human influence would destabilize their carefully structured society. These concerns seemed justified when reports arrived of civil unrest on several worlds where traditional engineers clashed with younger colleagues who wanted to adopt human methods. The Empire faced the possibility of technological civil war. Emperor Zalthon called Jake and Princess Lyra to a private meeting where he expressed his concerns about the disruption that human ideas were causing throughout the Empire. He worried that the stability his people had enjoyed for centuries was being threatened. Jake listened respectfully to the Emperor's concerns and then offered a different perspective on the situation. He suggested that the unrest was not caused by human ideas themselves, but by the resistance to change that prevented smooth adoption of new methods. Princess Lyra supported Jake's analysis and pointed out that the worlds experiencing the most problems were those where traditional leaders had forbidden any experimentation with human techniques. She proposed a gradual integration program that would allow different worlds to adopt human methods at their own pace, rather than forcing immediate empire-wide changes. The Emperor was impressed by their thoughtful approach and agreed to consider their proposal. He was beginning to understand that Jake represented not a threat to Zephyrian civilization, but an opportunity to make it stronger and more resilient. However, their discussions were interrupted by urgent news from the Empire's border regions. Long-range sensors had detected massive fleets belonging to the Perfectionist Collective approaching Zephyrian space with obvious hostile intent. The Perfectionist Collective was an ancient enemy that the Empire had not seen for over 50 years. They were machine intelligences that believed organic life was a chaotic mistake that needed to be eliminated from the universe. Their technology was mathematically perfect, and their strategies were based on flawless, logical analysis. In previous conflicts, the Zephyrians had barely managed to fight them to a standstill, using superior numbers and defensive positions. But now the collective had returned with larger fleets and more advanced weapons. Emperor Zalthon realized that traditional Zephyrian tactics might not be sufficient to defeat an enemy that had spent decades perfecting their approach to warfare. As news of the approaching threat spread through the Empire, Princess Lyra looked at Jake with hope in her violet eyes. She believed that human unpredictability might be exactly what they needed to defeat an enemy that planned for every logical possibility. Jake studied the intelligence reports about collective tactics and began to formulate ideas about how human chaos engineering might be adapted for military purposes. The fate of the Empire might depend on whether organized imperfection could triumph over mathematical perfection. Emperor Zalthon sat on his crystal throne in the heart of the Imperial Palace and read the report from his daughter with growing concern. Princess Lyra had sent detailed analysis of her encounter with the human engineer, along with technical specifications that made no sense according to Zephyrian science. The Emperor was a wise ruler who had guided his people for over 2 centuries, but he had never encountered anything quite like this situation. The report described engineering techniques that violated fundamental principles while somehow achieving superior results. This troubled him deeply. He called for his chief science advisor, Grand Engineer Mordan, who had served the imperial court for even longer than the emperor himself. Mordan was considered one of the greatest minds in the galaxy and had designed many of the advanced systems that made the Zephyrian Empire so powerful. When Mordan arrived, the emperor handed him Princess Lyra's report and waited while the old scientist read through the technical details. He watched as Mordan's expression changed from skeptical amusement to serious concern, and finally to something approaching fear. Mordan set down the report and looked directly at the Emperor with worry in his ancient eyes. He said that if the humans' techniques became widespread throughout the galaxy, it could threaten the very foundation of Zephyrian technological superiority. The Zephyrian Empire had built its power on the fact that their science was more advanced than any other civilization. Their technology was more efficient, their ships were faster, and their weapons were more powerful than anything their enemies could produce. But the humans' approach suggested that superior technology might not require superior science. If crude, but effective solutions could outperform elegant Zephyrian systems, then other civilizations might begin to question why they needed Zephyrian expertise at all. Emperor Zalthon understood the implications immediately. The Empire's influence throughout the galaxy was based on other species needing Zephyrian technology to solve their most difficult problems. If humans could teach simpler solutions, then the Empire's position as the galaxy's technological leader would be threatened. The Emperor made a decision that he hoped would resolve the situation before it could become a serious problem. He would issue a formal challenge to the human engineer. If Jake Morrison could solve 3 impossible problems that had stumped Zephyrian scientists for centuries, then his methods would be acknowledged as legitimate, but if the human failed, then his techniques would be declared dangerous and primitive. All human ships would be banned from Zephyrian space, and no further contact would be permitted between the two species. Emperor Zalthon chose the 3 challenges carefully. Each one represented a different type of problem that had resisted solution. Despite decades of work by the Empire's best minds, the first involved repairing an ancient defense grid using only primitive tools and materials. The second challenge required optimizing the efficiency of quantum reactors that powered the Empire's largest cities. The third was solving the mystery of why their newest class of starships experienced random system failures that could not be predicted or prevented. These problems had been studied by thousands of scientists and engineers over many years. Every possible approach had been tried and failed. The Emperor was confident that the human would be unable to succeed where so many brilliant Zephyrian minds had failed. Princess Lyra received news of her father's challenge with mixed emotions. She was excited about the opportunity to see more of Jake's problem-solving abilities, but worried about what would happen if he failed. She knew that her father was not making an idle threat about banning humans from Zephyrian space. She decided to visit Jake again and warn him about the seriousness of the situation. When she arrived at the space station, she found him working on another repair project with the same cheerful confidence he had shown before. Jake listened to Princess Lyra's explanation of the challenge with interest rather than fear. He said that solving impossible problems was what he did every day and asked when he could get started. His casual attitude both impressed and worried Princess Lyra. The first challenge took place at an ancient orbital defense platform that had been built over 1,000 years ago. The massive structure protected one of the Empire's most important worlds, but its control systems had been failing for decades. Zephyrian engineers had tried to repair the platform using modern technology, but the ancient systems were incompatible with current equipment. The original builders had used techniques that were no longer understood, and replacement parts were impossible to manufacture. Jake arrived at the platform with a simple toolkit and spent several hours studying the failed systems. The Zephyrian observers expected him to request advanced diagnostic equipment and specialized components, but instead he began dismantling the control panels with basic hand tools. Princess Lyra watched as Jake examined the ancient circuits and started making notes in a small notebook. He seemed completely unconcerned about the age or complexity of the technology, and treated it like any other broken machine that needed fixing. Jake discovered that the platform's problems were caused by corrosion in the connection points between different system components. Over centuries of operation, tiny amounts of contamination had built up and disrupted the flow of control signals. The Zephyrian solution had been to try to replace all the contaminated components with modern equivalents. But Jake realized that the contamination itself was not the real problem. The issue was that the ancient systems had been designed to work with a small amount of imperfection. He began cleaning the connection points and then deliberately adding controlled amounts of resistance to match the original specifications. Instead of trying to make the ancient systems perfect, Jake was restoring them to their intended state of planned imperfection. When Jake activated the repaired platform, it came online immediately and operated better than it had in decades. The Zephyrian engineers stared in amazement, as systems they had spent years trying to fix began working perfectly under Jake's deliberately imperfect repair. The second challenge involved the quantum reactors that powered Imperial City, the capital of the Zephyrian Empire. These massive machines provided energy for billions of people, but they operated at only 60% of their theoretical efficiency. Zephyrian scientists had spent centuries trying to optimize the reactors by making their components more precise and their control systems more sophisticated. Every improvement seemed to help initially, but then efficiency would drop back to the same 60% level. Jake studied the reactor designs for 3 days and then announced that the problem was not insufficient precision, but too much precision. The quantum systems were designed to operate in controlled chaos, but the Zephyrian improvements had eliminated all randomness from the process. He proposed introducing deliberate fluctuations into the reactor control systems. The Zephyrian scientists were horrified at the idea of deliberately destabilizing their most important power source, but Princess Lyra convinced them to let Jake try his approach on a small test reactor. Jake's modifications increased the test reactor's efficiency to 90% within hours. The controlled chaos he introduced allowed the quantum processes to find optimal states that pure precision could never achieve. The third challenge involved the mysterious failures affecting the Empire's newest starships. These vessels represented the pinnacle of Zephyrian engineering, but they suffered from random malfunctions that seemed to have no logical cause. Jake spent a week aboard one of the affected ships studying the failure patterns. He discovered that the ships were too perfect. Every system was so precisely calibrated that tiny variations in manufacturing or operation could cause unexpected interactions between components. The solution was to introduce what Jake called tolerances into the ship's systems. Instead of trying to make everything work exactly the same, every time he designed buffers that could absorb small variations and prevent them from cascading into major failures. When Jake's modifications were installed, the random failures stopped completely. The ships actually became more reliable by being deliberately less perfect Emperor. Zalthon received reports of Jake's success with growing amazement and concern. The human had solved 3 impossible problems in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Zephyrian science. The Emperor realized that he could not dismiss human engineering as primitive or dangerous. Jake Morrison had proven that his techniques were not only valid, but potentially superior to traditional Zephyrian methods. But this success created an even bigger problem for the Empire. If human approaches were truly better, then everything the Zephyrians believed about their technological superiority would need to be reconsidered. Princess Lyra Veltar stepped off her royal transport ship and onto the deck of the Zephyrian space station with the grace that came naturally to someone born into galactic royalty. Her luminescent blue skin seemed to glow softly under the stations. Lights and her long silver hair flowed behind her like liquid starlight. The violet eyes that had inspired poets across a dozen star systems focused intently on the human cargo ship docked at the far end of the station. She wore the simple white robes of a scientist, rather than the elaborate gowns expected of imperial royalty. Princess Lyra had never cared much for fancy clothes or royal ceremonies. Her true passion was understanding how the universe worked, and today she hoped to solve a mystery that had been bothering her for 3 days. Behind her walked a small group of nervous Zephyrian officials who were not sure why the Emperor's daughter had suddenly decided to visit this remote station. They whispered among themselves about proper protocols and diplomatic procedures, but Princess Lyra ignored them completely. She had more important things on her mind than court etiquette station. Commander Velthak hurried forward to greet her, with deep bows and formal speeches about the honor of her visit. Princess Lyra nodded politely, but cut him short with a simple question about where she could find the human mechanic who had performed the impossible hyperdrive repair. The commander looked confused and slightly embarrassed. He explained that the human was currently in Engineering Bay 7, working on some kind of maintenance project. He offered to have the human cleaned up and brought to the station's formal meeting chambers, where they could speak in a more appropriate setting. Princess Lyra shook her head and said she would go to the human herself. The commander and his staff looked shocked at the idea of royal princess visiting a dirty engineering bay, but they knew better than to argue with the Emperor's daughter when she had made up her mind about something. They walked through the station's corridors toward the engineering section. Princess Lyra had spent most of her life in the clean, sterile laboratories of the Imperial Science Academy, and she found the industrial areas of the station fascinating. There were pipes and cables running along the walls, and the air smelled of metal and machine oil. When they reached Engineering Bay 7, Princess Lyra could hear someone singing an old Earth song while working on some kind of machinery. The sound was completely unlike the formal music of the Zephyrian court. It was rough and simple, but somehow full of joy and energy that made her smile. She stepped through the doorway and saw a human male bent over an open control panel with tools scattered around him on the floor. He was wearing simple work clothes that were stained with grease, and his brown hair was messy from running his hands through it while he worked. This was Jake Morrison, and Princess Lyra felt her breath catch in her throat for reasons she could not quite understand. She had expected to meet a primitive creature barely capable of intelligent thought. Instead, she found herself looking at someone who seemed completely focused on his work and entirely comfortable with the complex machinery around him. Jake was, humming to himself while he rewired a power distribution unit that had been giving the station engineers problems for weeks. He had already figured out that the Zephyrian approach to the problem was far too complicated and was installing a much simpler solution using basic electrical principles. Princess Lyra watched in fascination as Jake worked. His movements were confident and efficient, but also somehow gentle. He treated the machinery like it was a living thing that needed care, rather than just a collection of parts to be manipulated. When Jake finally noticed that someone was watching him, he looked up and saw the most beautiful woman he had ever laid eyes on. Her blue skin and silver hair were unlike anything from Earth, but her smile was warm and kind in a way that needed no translation between species. Jake climbed out of the control panel and wiped his hands on his work shirt before extending one toward Princess Lyra. He introduced himself with a simple hello and said he was sorry about the mess, but he had been trying to fix the station's power problems. The Zephyrian officials behind Princess Lyra gasped in horror at Jake's casual behavior. Touching royalty without permission was forbidden, and failing to use proper titles and formal greetings could be considered an insult to the entire empire. But Princess Lyra reached out and shook Jake's hand with genuine pleasure. His grip was firm and warm, and she could feel the calluses that came from years of working with tools. She introduced herself simply as Lyra and said she was interested in learning about his approach to engineering. Jake grinned and said he would be happy to show her what he was working on. He explained that the station's power distribution system was having problems because it was designed to be too perfect. Every component was precisely calibrated, and when one small part failed, the entire system became unstable. Princess Lyra followed Jake as he pointed out various parts of the machinery and explained his solution. Instead of trying to maintain perfect balance throughout the system, Jake was installing what he called buffer zones. These were simple circuits that could absorb fluctuations and keep the system running even when individual components were not working perfectly as Jake talked. Princess Lyra realized that his approach to engineering was completely different from everything she had been taught. Zephyrian technology was based on achieving perfect harmony between all components. Every system was designed to work flawlessly under ideal conditions, but Jake's human engineering assumed that things would go wrong and planned for those failures in advance. His systems were designed to keep working even when they were broken or damaged. Princess Lyra had never heard of such an approach and found it both fascinating and slightly disturbing. Jake demonstrated his buffer zone concept by deliberately damaging one of the power circuits. In a normal Zephyrian system, this would have caused cascading failures throughout the entire network. But Jake's modified system simply rerouted power around the damaged area and continued operating normally. Princess Lyra stared at the readings on her handheld scanner in amazement. Jake had just proven that deliberate imperfection could actually make a system more reliable than careful precision. This went against everything she thought she knew about engineering and physics. She asked Jake to explain how he had learned these techniques, and he told her about growing up on a farm where machinery had to keep working no matter what went wrong. He talked about fixing tractors with spare parts and keeping old trucks running long past their expected lifetime. Jake's stories about human engineering were full of concepts that had no equivalent in Zephyrian science. He talked about making do with what you had available and finding creative solutions when the proper parts were not accessible. He described the human philosophy of good enough being better than perfect, if perfect was not achievable. Princess Lyra found herself laughing at Jake's descriptions of some of his more creative repairs. She had never heard anyone talk about machinery with such obvious affection and humor. In Zephyrian culture, technology was something to be respected and treated with formal precision as they talked. Princess Lyra began to understand that Jake represented something completely new in her experience. He was not trying to impress her with his knowledge or status. He simply enjoyed sharing his work with someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding. Jake showed Princess Lyra several other examples of human engineering principles. He demonstrated what he called percussive maintenance by fixing a stuck valve with a few strategic taps from a wrench. He explained redundant safety systems that provided multiple backup plans for every critical function. Each demonstration challenged another fundamental assumption of Zephyrian science. Princess Lyra had been taught that elegant solutions were always superior to crude ones. But Jake's crude solutions consistently outperformed the elegant Zephyrian systems in practical reliability. When Princess Lyra finally returned to her ship hours later, she could not stop thinking about her conversation with Jake Morrison. She had come to the station expecting to quickly solve a minor scientific puzzle. Instead, she had discovered an entirely new way of thinking about technology and problem-solving. That night, Princess Lyra lay in her cabin, staring at the stars outside her window and wondering what other surprises human thinking might contain. She had spent her whole life believing that Zephyrian science represented the pinnacle of galactic achievement, but Jake Morrison had shown her that there might be wisdom in approaches that seemed primitive on the surface. Princess Lyra decided that she needed to learn much more about human engineering before she could truly understand what she had witnessed. Jake Morrison wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag and looked at the hyperdrive engine one more time. The massive machine hummed quietly in the engine room of the cargo ship New Horizon, carrying supplies from Earth to the outer colonies. Jake had been working on ships like this for 8 years now, and he knew every bolt and wire by heart. The captain's voice came through the intercom and told everyone to prepare for the next jump to hyperspace. Jake checked all the readings on his screens, and everything looked normal. The engine was running smooth, and all the safety systems showed green lights. He had done this routine 1,000 times before. The ship began to shake slightly as the hyperdrive started to charge up. Jake felt the familiar vibration through the metal floor under his feet. In a few minutes, they would be jumping through space faster than light itself. He never got tired of that feeling, even though he was just a simple mechanic. Suddenly, the ship lurched hard to one side, and Jake grabbed onto a support beam to keep from falling. Red warning lights started flashing everywhere, and alarms began screaming throughout the ship. The hyperdrive was making a terrible grinding noise that Jake had never heard before. He ran to his control panel and saw that the main power coupling was failing. The energy readings were jumping all over the place and getting worse by the second. If the hyperdrive exploded while they were in hyperspace, the entire ship and everyone on it would be scattered across a million pieces of space. Jake's hands moved quickly over the controls, trying to stabilize the system. He rerouted power from the backup generators and tried to shut down the failing coupling, but nothing worked. The grinding noise got louder and sparks started flying from the main console. Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom again, but this time he sounded worried. He was asking Jake what was happening and whether they were going to make it through the jump safely. Jake could hear the fear in the captain's voice even though he was trying to hide it. The hyperdrive suddenly made a sound like metal tearing apart, and the ship dropped out of hyperspace with a violent jolt that threw Jake against the wall. Emergency lighting came on as the main power systems failed. The ship was now drifting in normal space somewhere far from their planned route. Jake got back to his feet and looked at the damage. The main hyperdrive was completely dead, and the ship's systems were offline. The backup power was keeping life support running, but that was about all. They were stranded in empty space with no way to call for help. He opened up the main engine housing and climbed inside to see what had gone wrong. The power coupling had completely burned out and taken several other important parts with it. According to everything Jake knew about hyperdrives, this kind of damage should be impossible to fix without a full repair station and weeks of work. But Jake Morrison was not the kind of person who gave up easily. He had grown up fixing old cars and trucks on his family's farm, and he had learned that there was always a way to make something work if you were creative enough. His father had taught him that any machine was just a collection of parts that could be rearranged or replaced with whatever you had available. He went to the ship's supply room and gathered up everything he could find that might be useful. There were spare electrical cables, some metal plates from the kitchen, a few old computer parts, and even some wire coat hangers from the crew quarters. Most mechanics would have laughed at the idea of fixing a hyperdrive with such basic materials. Jake spread everything out on the engine room floor and started thinking. The burned-out power coupling was supposed to regulate the flow of energy from the main reactor to the hyperdrive core. It did this using a complex system of quantum field generators and exotic matter conduits that cost more than most people. Made in a year, but Jake realized that all those expensive parts were really just doing one simple job. They were controlling how much power went where and when. He had been doing the same thing with car engines since he was 12 years old, using nothing more than basic electrical components. He started connecting wires and rerouting power cables in ways that would have made any trained engineer nervous. Instead of trying to replace the quantum field generators, he used simple resistors and capacitors to control the power flow. Where the exotic matter conduits had failed, he installed regular copper wiring with manual switches. The other crew members gathered around to watch Jake work. Chief Engineer Martinez shook his head and said it would never work. The ship's computer specialist Lisa Chen said that what Jake was doing violated at least 6 fundamental laws of physics. Even Captain Rodriguez looked doubtful, but Jake kept working. He welded metal plates together to create new housing for his improvised components. He used his knowledge of basic electrical circuits to replace systems that normally required advanced computer control. When he needed a pressure regulator, he made one out of springs and metal washers. After 6 hours of work, Jake had created something that looked nothing like a proper hyperdrive coupling, but somehow managed to do the same job. He connected the last wire and powered up the system. The engines came back online and the hyperdrive began its startup sequence. Everyone held their breath as Jake activated his jury-rigged repair. The ship's systems came back online one by one, and the hyperdrive core began to glow with its familiar blue light. Against all odds and expectations, Jake's impossible fix was actually working. They were able to jump back into hyperspace and continue their journey. The improvised coupling held together perfectly and even seemed to be running more efficiently than the original expensive parts. Jake had taken a completely dead hyperdrive and brought it back to life using nothing more than spare parts and common sense. When they finally reached the nearest space station, Jake's reputation had already begun to spread. Word traveled fast in space about the human mechanic who had fixed the impossible and saved his ship using materials that most civilizations would consider primitive junk. The space station belonged to the Zephyrian Empire, and their engineers came aboard to inspect Jake's repair work. They stared at his improvised coupling in complete confusion. According to their understanding of technology, what Jake had built should not have worked at all. Their computer models said it was impossible, but there it was running perfectly and actually improving the ship's performance. The Zephyrian engineers took detailed scans and measurements but could not explain how such a simple system could replace their advanced technology. They had never seen anything like Jake Morrison's creative approach to problem-solving. One of the Zephyrian engineers sent a message to his superiors about the strange human and his impossible repair. The message eventually reached the desk of Princess Lyra Veltar, who was known throughout the galaxy as both the most beautiful woman alive and one of the most brilliant scientists in the Empire. Princess Lyra read the report about Jake's hyperdrive repair 3 times before she could believe what she was seeing. She had spent years studying the theoretical limits of hyperdrive technology and knew that what this human had accomplished should have been completely impossible. She decided that she had to meet this Jake Morrison in person and see his work for herself. She ordered her personal ship to be prepared for immediate departure to the space station where the human's cargo vessel was docked. Princess Lyra had never met a human before, but she was about to discover that they were far more interesting than anyone in the galaxy had ever imagined.